everyone, welcome back to Pass the Aux Cord, a channel where I still can't find the mic stand, and welcome back to Album of the Day. Today we're going to be taking a look at Faith in Persona by Death's Dynamic Shroud. Death's Dynamic Shroud are a vaporwave, electronic, sound collage, and ambient trio. They originally started gaining notoriety in the vaporwave community around the year 2014 with excellent projects such as Virtual Utopia Experience. Shortly thereafter, they made one of the most influential, notable, and well-respected projects in the entire genre with I'll Try Living Like This. This one has become a staple for the genre and the entire decade of music that it came out in. It was followed up thereafter with Classroom Sex Tape, which is also a pretty well-respected album for very good reason, which did a lot to further solidify them even outside of the vaporwave niche. Back in 2020, they started their New World Mixtape Club, which is a club in which they release a mixtape every month to their fans. Faith in Persona ending up being one of those. The trio only work on their most ambitious projects as an entire group, whereas most of these mixtapes, as well as some of the other projects they put out throughout the years, will typically only consist of one or two members' work. Faith in Persona is entirely handled by Keith Rankin. And since its 2021 release, Faith in Persona has been one of the favorite of these mixtapes pretty easily and one of the favorite projects from this band overall. As we will explain later on, this one is clearly worth the hype. When vaporwave is mentioned, you will probably envision something like the infamous Floral Shop by Macintosh Plus. Near the start of the genre, all it essentially would do is take some pretty simple samples of a lot of 80s nostalgia, things along that line, and then mess with the pacing, the tone, the pitch of everything, and give it a bit of a spacey and ambient twist. Death's Dynamic Shroud does do all of that, but the other places they go with it is entirely unique to them. On Faith in Persona, you can expect to hear a wide variety of sounds and samples that come together to create quite the experience. Vocals are used prominently on this project, but it reminds me more of Plunderphonics than it does vaporwave, because rather than taking the entire line from a song and skewing it in some way, it's more like one line is taken and then each word from it is used as a note of the instrument. Samples and chopped up instrumental bits are typically the glue used to bring us these sound collages as a whole piece. Whether it be some of that aforementioned retro 80s style pop instrumentation, spacey synths, or some rich sound effects placed throughout, you're never really going to know exactly what you're going to hear with such a wide assortment being utilized here. But what's important is that it does come together to bring us a very cohesive experience and a legitimately strong feeling overall. Most of these songs have what you could point out as being a dramatic, explosive, climactic moment, which is something pretty different from vaporwave as a whole, where it tends to be more on the ambient side of things. While it may not feel like it given the lack of a real written verse or chorus, the structure of the songs here are pretty traditional overall, with something you could point at as being the chorus typically, as well as there usually being a bridge or outro section. No matter how much we pick individual pieces apart, what's really important here is the dynamic diversity used to create epic moments across the album. I could probably talk all day about this, but at the end of the day, their sound is something that's better heard than described. The lyrics section almost doesn't need to be here because things aren't written out in a traditional way. Because while there are technically lyrics to be mentioned, as I said, a lot of the vocals here are used more as an instrument. You could easily make the argument that there is meaning to be pulled from the words used, but it's so abstract and up for interpretation that it's hard for me personally to pull what exactly the meaning would be, and that's something that you'll probably have to do on your own listen. If we look at the opening song, the loop that's used is "I don't know why, but I want to find out." It's a very early and specific example of exactly what I mean, because there's two ways that you could even just take this one phrase on its own. You could say that you don't know why something is, but you want to find out why it is that way. Or you can say that you want to find out why something is one way, but you don't know why you want to find that out. If you actually piece it out, there's more than one way you could take even just that simple of a sentence. The clearest track lyrically, if we wanted to point one out, is definitely Just to Be Needed, as it does seem to be a love song of some sort. However, it does even then depend on your interpretation just because of how much vagueness is here, whether this is something like a actual romantic love song or if it's about something like a breakup. This is another thing that we'll bring up later, but I think how up to interpretation this album really is something quite beautiful. There's just enough pieces on this album to make you feel something very specific without actually spelling it out to you through the lyrics. What you make of the thematic focus is up to your own interpretation. Moving on to the track-by-track section, we have the first one here, Tear in Abyss. The down-pitched vocal sample saying, "I won't give up on you," is a very nice way to ease us in, before the song builds up to a very dynamic and epic place shortly thereafter. This track is a beautiful set of build-ups and conclusions. It's like we go another layer deeper with each of the 6 minutes that pass, and with each stylistic switch-up. The "I don't know why, but I want to find out" vocal sample that loops all throughout the track, for the most part, does a lot to ground the listener, while the rest of it is a very adventurous take on things. The mix of sounds is absolutely magical, including and leading up to the very spacey and minimal outro. And I also especially love the percussion choices taken up here. The first time I heard See Me was on a drive. I went down a hill and I noticed that the sky in front of me looked really beautiful. There were thick clouds, but they had many breaks in them, letting the sunshine fall through, and I thought this song accented that visual very well, given how brightly glowing this one is. Much like the songs before it, See Me has several moments of entirely switching its tone and bringing you somewhere else. There are more minimal parts of the song where you're met with very little besides the song's title being repeated in the sample, and these moments are absolutely blissful. The shimmering intro to the track is one of the best moments on the album entirely. What those blissful and slightly more disjointed passages, however, lead to is something much more interesting, arguably. Shortly after the first quarter of the track, there's this section that builds up to a more bouncy, glitchy, and fast-paced portion that's such a delight to listen to. There's a very unlikely combination of sounds used here, but what those unlikely combinations are used to create is very impressive. What's somehow even more magical than See Me is the wild, fun, and psychedelic title track. I would say the range of sounds that are utilized on Faith and Persona, this title track, is a lot smaller than the two before it, but we do still hit some pretty epic peaks and valleys. What I would bargain to call the chorus section, you'll know it if you hear it, is such an explosive and impressive moment. If that doesn't have me just floating out of my seat, I don't know what does. In a way, at this quarter way through the album, it is nice to have something that's a little bit more song-like and a little less disjointed. The otherworldly sounds utilized are more than enough to keep it interesting. Track 4 is Pop Chin. While the title track is definitely one of the more psychedelic on the album, I would say that Pop Chin pushes it even further. The trippy synths, atmospheric sounds, and soulful vocal sample really immerse the listener. While that is the case, the immersion is a little bit more familiar, with this one reminding me a bit more of traditional pop songs, at least relatively compared to the more outlandish ones on this project. The whole song is such a fun and bopping tune that it probably wouldn't have even needed to do something more interesting than do what it presents in the first minute or so. But when we hit the 2-minute mark, we're hit with a huge explosion of euphoria anyway. It's moments like the end of this track that really show you why this is totally different than your average Vaporwave project. I am intrigued right from the opening seconds of Someone in the Room, which sounds like some sort of monstrous beast either roaring or taking a bite out of something. And from those first seconds, this has been a favorite of mine. I'm a sucker for percussion, especially in styles like this where you can essentially sample whatever you want, and Someone in the Room does exactly what I would like it to. This song definitely has the most definitive bounce and groove to it. There may be significantly less variation and dynamics than a track like See Me, but it doesn't really feel necessary. The entire song is like the more explosive moments of the ones before it, just extended to a full-length song. It's such a satisfying listen. What I'd call the most euphoric and danceable track on the album with the previous one is then directly contrasted with Just to Be Needed, as this may be the most emotional feeling song on the project. The title is pretty self-explanatory in terms of meaning or feeling, and this song also has the closest thing to a definitive set of lyrics to it, with everything being written out pretty clearly, even though it is all samples for the most part. Your interpretation, as I mentioned before, is definitely still still variable, but it is pretty clear this is a love song of some sort. What's crazy though is how this song manages to feel more like love or more like heartbreak depending on your mindset with it than most love or heartbreak songs do. The slow moments that usually just consist of spacey strings and moody vocals evoke emotion that eventually leads up to a cathartic release later in the track. The bridge and refrain sections, being the most densely layered, introduce vocal samples from both Keith himself and Ariana Grande, with the most prominent one staying in focus. Having a mix of all three different voices at once is simply indescribable. Say whatever you may, but this is one of the most beautiful pieces of music I've ever heard. If the doctor goes, "You've got 7 minutes left to live," I'm using 6 of them on this song. Track 7, Last Minutes of Memory, brings us into a similarly poppy place to where we were with Someone in the Room. This time around there's that same punchy percussion and uptick in speed, but this one feels more like a bright burst of light. The shimmering and nostalgic samples and sounds used on here really bring an overall feeling of triumph and some great imagery to mind. This track is another to hit us with a massive explosion in the last quarter, and this time it feels epic and huge enough to be the climax of the entire album before leading us into our fourth and final act. Track 8, simply called ... or ellipsis in parentheses, whatever you may want to call it, is essentially very self-explanatory. It is just a few minutes of complete silence, save for what I hear maybe being some slight wind sounds or something of that nature, but I could just be hallucinating it too, who knows? Either way, what it does for the album's pacing is something pretty daring, and it's something that I appreciate a lot. Giving us minutes to reflect in silence about the feelings that the album brings about really makes the whole experience feel a lot more impactful. On an ordinary track list, this would be completely meaningless and pointless, but here it feels important. And that moves us on to track number 9, the final song, R.I.P. R.I.P. is one of the most fitting album closers I have ever heard. It is very minimal, one of the least complicated tracks by far, and it is essentially just the same loop over and over again for its duration, with very few changes throughout. The somber piano and layered vocals make you feel like you're sitting in the vastness of space. It's not what one would expect to hear by any means, and maybe not what you would want to hear, given the triumphant nature of most of the songs before this point. But it doesn't need to be that. There doesn't need to be some eruption to get the point across. R.I.P. is the calm after the storm, and it is fantastic at being exactly that. This project is my favorite Vaporwave project overall, and while it seems very clear to me personally, it is something that I have difficulty putting into words in a way. When there's so much left up to interpretation, it's hard to quantify certain things. What's really great about Faith in Persona is how it manages to take the sum of its parts and make it into something much greater. The ability to use these sounds to make the listener feel something and take you on a journey is really impressive. It certainly exceeds at all of that. And even just hearing the titles of the songs, I'm sure you can gather your own interpretation, but actually sitting and immersing yourself in the sounds here is how you will get the full experience. And while I do wish that there was more that I could explain to you and give you a better picture, I guess the point here that I always wanted to make this is to have you go check out the music. So go check out the music. Before you do, if you wouldn't mind hitting the video with a like and letting me know of what you think of the album or the video in the comment section below, that would be fantastic and I would greatly appreciate it. And you can come back every weekday. We are going to be diving into another album so we can just experience new things together. If you have any suggestions for album of the day, feel free to drop them down below as well. Other than that, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.